It's so wonderful to be here with everyone today and to be diving into such what I think is going to be a really wonderful and insightful conversation. And this conversation today is on the poem entitled Forgiveness by Aaron Samuels. And I've known Aaron for a little bit, and I'm just so excited that we're going to get a chance to kind of like dig deep into this wonderful poem. The best way to describe the poem, in case someone hasn't seen it yet, to use Aaron's words, it explores the traditional spiritual space as we enter on Kol Nidre. The piece also interrogates Jewish communities' collective atonement journey as we grapple with the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of racism that were intertwined and hyper-present in the years 5780 and 5781. This piece will invite the listener to question their own processes of atonement and forgiveness. And I don't think there's anything better that we could be doing in this moment except, addressing those very questions, those very prompts. And I'm really excited to be joined by such a wonderful panel of really impressive people who I'm going to now get the chance to introduce individually. So first off, we have Tyler Samuels. Tyler is a Jew of Jamaican descent and a recent poli-sci and history graduate from the University of Toronto. He's also an intern at B'nai B'rith Canada and the Vice President of Engagement at Jews of Color Canada. So excited to have you with us, Tyler. Claire Nyman. Claire grew up on the cusp of different racial and religious communities. During her college career at Arizona State University, Claire trained in the art of inclusivity, spent time as an ASU Hillel Interfaith and Social Action Fellow, and participated as an Obama Foundation Civic Leadership Summit trainee, all fueling her passion for justice, community engagement, inclusivity, and bridging the gap between different communities. Currently, Claire is the Springboard Social Justice Fellow at University of Arizona Hillel. So glad to have you, Claire. Tova Ricardo is a Black Orthodox Ashkenazi Jew from Northern California. Ricardo is a recent graduate of Columbia University in New York City, where she majored in English and sociology. She was a planning committee member of Hillel International's Black Jewish cohort and is the communications coordinator at Kamocha, a Black Orthodox organization, part of the Jewish Federations of North America. Everyone, welcome. Tova, welcome. It's so great to be with you all today. And we're just going to hop right into this conversation here with some questions that I think are going to be your responses are going to be really insightful and helpful for everyone to hear. So starting from, the piece, Aaron's poem, Forgiveness, it's rich on so many levels. I especially found it powerful because in my mind, it sanctifies the unique experiences of Black lives by acknowledging, on the one hand, what it feels like to be in a Black body, and then combining that, on the other hand, with ritual and liturgy. So my starting question for all of you is this. What was it like for you to experience, to see, to hear this poem that sanctifies Black life and acknowledges how Black life is sometimes devalued, even in sacred Jewish spaces? And Tova, especially since I know you're also a spoken word artist and a poet, let's go with you first to kick it off for us.
So I know Aaron Samuels, and he's an absolutely amazing poet. And as a poet myself, I found that piece was one of the most accurate depictions of, at least from my personal experience, of what it means to be a Black Jewish person in America. He integrated Hebrew, he integrated what it means to go to services and to be in synagogue with other people, but also acknowledging your Blackness and how sometimes your Jewishness and your Blackness can come into conflict because of the societal issues that are being faced in society, talking about metal detectors, talking about confronting police officers, security guards, while trying to pray. And that is something that I've grappled with for the past couple years is how can I make the prayer space for me a place where I don't have to worry about my Blackness, worry about people asking me if I belong there, asking me if I really am Jewish, letting the prayer space, letting synagogue, letting services be an environment that is truly supposed to be holy in a conversation with God and not colored by racism or ignorance.
That there's so much of what you said really is profound and resonates, and I think that was a really felicitous use of the word, like to have the experience colored by racism. I'm curious for you, Tyler, how did this land with you? Were your experiences similar to Tova? Did they go in a different direction? Would love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, up here in Canada, it's not as diverse as the United States. So when I first saw the video, what first attracted me was the diversity of the faces in the video, because we don't have that up here. There are occasions where I feel like I'm the only Black Jew, and then I forget my best friend is also Black and Jewish. But it's that rare to see those faces. And I can relate to Tova's point, because many occasion, whether it's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or any Jewish event or holiday, you go to synagogue. Here, more or less, there will be security or police officers up here on major important holidays. And it is stressful. It's very stressful because you don't know the reaction. You don't know what will happen. And I think with this poem, it relates to me in the sense that it addresses that, but I think this can be used as a tool to educate non-JOC Jews the experiences of Jews of color when it comes to these types of topics, when it comes to celebrating Jewish life in religious spaces, but then being persecuted or being stopped or being manhandled by security or police, or even members of the synagogue. Because I have plenty of stories of what are you doing here? Why you don't belong here? So this poem, I watched it and it meant a lot. It meant a lot to me in that sense.
That's really powerful. The idea that this could be a tool to educate. And so it's a tool to educate that on the one hand acknowledges the experiences that you might have experienced, maybe that all of us have experienced at some point or another, all of us who are on the screen on this podcast momentarily. And the fact that this tool of education could also be like liturgy and sanctified. I mean, we have so many liturgical touch points throughout this piece. Claire, I'd love to get a sense of how this landed for you. What was it like to experience this poem and all of the content that is contained in it?
For me, it was emotional in all capital letters. The diction, the reader's tone and tonal shifts, the visuals and more came together to create an unbelievably powerful piece. Like Tyler, as someone who has had limited exposure to Jews of color and much less other Black Jews, the visuals were extremely important for me. Those in the video had, such extreme presence. And that presence to me said, we're here, we're valuable, we're Jewish, and none of that is up for debate. Their confidence for me was both inspiring and comforting at the same time. And Aaron really created something special here.
Well, I mean, I know that I might be biased knowing Aaron a little bit and being an artist myself, but I completely agree with you. Something really special is at work here. And I like the fact that you all talked in different ways about the visuals of what's happening here, because part of what this is getting at is like, what is it to be seen, and how being seen is kind of essential, especially if we want to have this sense of forgiveness in return that is so often like a theme that is developed throughout this entire time of year. And that kind of takes me into our second question here, which is part of the work of the month of Elul and this time that leads up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is that we seek to forgive others and to be forgiven. So as you all look back over this year, that some have framed as a racial uprising, I'm curious to know, what are the ways that you hope that people in your communities will seek out forgiveness? And what are some of the ways in which you all are seeking out forgiveness, whether from individuals, from community, obviously that which you feel comfortable sharing with potentially hundreds of thousands of people? And let's start with you, Tyler.
For me, I have a very hard time with the concept of forgiveness, especially around this time of year. Especially this year, with everything that has happened in the news when it comes to racial justice and so on and so forth. For me, those Jewish organizations up here who have neglected, who have refused to participate in not working for equality and justice and pushing anti-discrimination measures within the Jewish community, especially in Toronto, where I live, but just acknowledging that there's an issue, that there's a problem. They have failed to do this. And for me, this has been going on since like 10 years ago, when I became more active in this, I guess, struggle, as you can call it. They haven't done anything that I would think is acceptable. So for me, for them for forgiveness, I don't think, for me, I would even accept the word from them at this point, because they have had so many opportunities, they have had so many chances to work, to improve, to do outreach, and they failed each year. And it's a Jewish value that you do not have to accept an apology from someone. That is inherently Jewish. You do not need to accept an apology if someone apologizes to you, even if they do Teshuva, and even if they have forgiveness in their heart. You do not need to accept that. And I think at this stage in my life, it's very difficult to accept that apology or forgiveness from them, even if they do it, which I doubt. For me personally, forgiveness, this year has been very difficult, because for me, you have the pandemic, you have overreaching stress, you have stress around racial issues up here. We found thousands of indigenous kids buried in unmarked graves up here. And for me, a lot of anger. It has been a lot of anger and a lot of angry outlashing at people who I feel wanted to, I don't know, be educated in racial issues. And for me, I had just had enough. And I lashed out at them. And I feel that I shouldn't have lashed out. I should have been more open. But at the time, I just wasn't in the right space to deal with all that discussion and conversation. So I think for me, that would be forgiveness for myself this year, to reach out and seek their forgiveness for that. Yeah.
Well, Tyler, you brought the realness in that response, and I think we're all very appreciative of it. I mean, one thing that you really get at is one, the complexity of forgiveness, and also the boundaries of it. So yes, there are these ways in which you might be seeking forgiveness from some people who you might have lashed out this year, but also that's real. There are sometimes there might be limits in terms of what we're able to offer in terms of forgiveness. So thank you for kind of naming the difficulty and the boundaries of your experience, especially in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. Really appreciative of that. Claire, how about for you? I'm curious, what are the ways you hope people in your community will seek out forgiveness? And what are some of the ways in which you are seeking out forgiveness?
So one major theme in Judaism has to do with Shema, a Hebrew word, and also the title of one of our central prayers in Judaism. Some would define Shema as listening that results in action, response, and or adjustment. I hope that my communities will seek forgiveness by practicing this form of listening through ongoing learning and adjusted behavior with said learning and listening in mind. And I aim to do the same. Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing in the Hebrew into that, especially with Shema. I mean, it's true that it's maybe some people describe it as like listen or hear, but I mean, it's the way it's used inside of our prayers, it's imperative. It's that second person demand, which the fact that it's a verb, a verbal form that is imperative, that would seem to imply some kind of action. So I think you're spot on with that observation. Tova, how about for you and your communities and for yourself?
I personally feel for just like the larger American Jewish community, I kind of want to ask, how do you think I feel? I am a Jewish woman in America, and I'm also a Black American, African American person whose ancestors have been here for 400 years, not 10 years, not 20 years, not 40 years. My ancestors have been here for 400 years and were enslaved by this country and have had every disadvantage put up against them. And when I'm with my community, my Jewish community, there are people who are absolutely wonderful, people who are caring and kind and want to understand my experience. And then there are the people who could not care less what it's like for me to be a Black woman in America. Their only focus is, well, what did Black Lives Matter do this week or say this week? What did Al Sharpton say this week? What did Louis Farrakhan say? Why is that the first thing that comes to mind when I ask you to say that my life matters? And we could go in all day long about how problematic these leaders are, or this organization is, and the statements that they make. I think for my communities, my Jewish communities, I want them to really sit down with themselves and think about their perhaps learned bias against Black people in America. Why do you feel like you have to cross the street when you see a Black man coming? Why do you believe that all Black people have to sound a certain way? Why do you not think that why don't you think that I can be a Jewish person and be Black? What, like these are the questions. I don't care as much about if you want to appoint me to be a board member, you want to give more Jews of color leadership positions. You need to sit with yourself, because it doesn't affect me just as a Black Jew. This affects Black people in general, the Black people who are Christian, who are Muslim, atheists, etc., who you live with, who are in your neighborhoods. So I think Teshuva, I wish Teshuva for them is something that is extremely inward. They don't have to tell other people they're doing it. They don't have to post about it on Facebook. They don't have to post about it on Instagram. I don't care what book you're reading and what lecture you went to. I need it to be an internal work, a work you may have to, that requires crying, anger, frustration, but it needs to be real because it it's necessary for my people's survival and comfortability in our own country. And then for myself, I will quickly say that I will be asking for forgiveness from Hashem, the ways in which I have been too hard on myself this past year. And I've allowed people to walk over me and to say ignorant comments about me and my people and my family. And I just let it slide, or I did not do enough to educate them. I ask myself and Hashem for forgiveness to be able to be more calm, and in the ways in which I could have been better to myself and taken better care of myself, instead of always having to be the face or the voice of reason. Sometimes it's okay to not have an explanation, or to be able to help somebody. So that's what I'm offering.
Absolutely. I think a number of you are kind of pointing to this sense of just how exhausting it gets to always be the educator, to always be the representative. And I mean, just sharing for myself, I know one of the things that's been a little, to understate it a bit, it's been a little weird over this past year is like, after the murder of George Floyd, the ways in which communities, some white Jewish communities, some just generally predominantly white communities, kind of came out of the woodworks, and it was like, oh my goodness, we have to do something about this. Who are the Black people that we know that can come work with us on this, that, and the third? And so it was interesting to kind of move from a place of, I mean, by no means did I feel like necessarily ignored in my work. I'm a rabbinical student and, do other stuff after all, but it's like to go from a place of like, okay, maybe an email every now and then about this kind of work to suddenly an inbox full of emails. Will you be the representative? Will you educate? Et cetera, et cetera. It left me somewhere between, oh my goodness, this is really exhausting. And I don't want to have to educate, to like, also the question, where were you like last year, the year before, et cetera. So, and this also kind of ties into another thing that was implicit in a lot of what I think you all said, and leads to the next question. Forgiveness is hard. I mean, Tyler, you named it. And this poem is entitled Forgiveness, but the content contained inside of it references major acts of racialized harm, violence, and white supremacy. And this makes me wonder, like, what are the limits of forgiveness? Even as we're mindful, like, yes, we're approaching Yom Kippur. I'd love to hear how you all think about the limits of forgiveness inside of your own lives, your communities, or honestly, whatever way you want to take that question. And if we could start with you, Claire.
In my opinion, the limits of forgiveness are highly subjective and built by the forgiver. Aaron brings up kind of troubling thought in his poem. He says, while we ask for forgiveness, we continue to perpetrate harm. That led me to the question, does unlimited forgiveness, keep us in negative cycles? And perhaps it does. I would argue, though, that with a small framing adjustment, we can see unlimited or minimally limited forgiveness, which I like a little bit better, as particularly freeing. I often choose to have minimal limits when it comes to forgiveness, or when I offer forgiveness, and it truly makes me feel better. And I think, like I mentioned before, limits are built by the forgiver and need to revolve around the forgiver. So having minimal limits makes me feel very good.
I like that. I mean, the sense of context and the perspective of the person who's forgiving, which, I mean, maybe we could even use, that framework of thinking of like, if that person who is forgiving is the one who has been harmed, then we kind of need to keep them at the center of our thoughts when we think about this question of limits and forgiveness. So I think you really get at something with, maybe it's some limits around forgiveness, but it does seem to point towards something subjective. Tova, what about for you?
I'm interested in what is the intention of the person who's asking for forgiveness. That to me is kind of similar to what, to what Claire was saying is if you're asking for forgiveness because you genuinely are sorry and you are genuinely up to do the work to change, then I think that there is no limit because I believe that, as we need to be critical of ourselves and how we move through the world when, we're engaging with people who we do not look like or we don't know in order to make sure that we're properly including people and being respectful. I think that we are all the product at the end of the day of our societies. So we make mistakes. I know I make mistakes all the time. And when I'm asking for forgiveness, I'm usually trying to do it from a place of good intent because I want to change and I want to get better. And that's how we change. But if someone's just asking for forgiveness, once a year because it's the time that's marked on our calendar, or they were raised to just, say sorry and it doesn't really have a meaning to it, then that can be an issue. I think the limit is just around your intent. I don't have to forgive you if I feel that you are not being genuine.
Right, bringing around this point again of like not all requests for forgiveness need to be accepted, tying into what Tyler said earlier. But I think what's also really powerful about what you named is you said it's about intent, but for you, as you were describing it, intention is necessarily accompanied by action. And so that's a very specific kind of intention. And so it can't simply be just, oh, well, that wasn't my intention. And then there's, everything else in a person's life would point towards, well, it doesn't seem like you're actually being very intentional about kind of anything. You're just kind of going about. So I really like that nuance that you bring into that. Tyler, how about for you?
I guess you can call my opinion radical or extreme, but for me, no, I have a set line of what can be forgiven and what cannot be forgiven. And I've always had this issue when I remember one time in elementary school, a classmate called me the N-word, and the teacher said, "Oh, Tyler, you should forgive him. You shouldn't feel anger." And as a kid, I'm like, why should I forgive someone for calling me the N-word? Shouldn't he he seek my forgiveness? Shouldn't he be held responsible for the consequences of his actions? And I've always had that feeling. And then when I grew up and it happened more and more, I realized that for some reason it is expected upon Black people, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, or any other religion, they always have to forgive someone who harms us. And I've always had a deep, deep hatred of that. Because I won't say that if a white supremacist goes and kills 10, 11 people in a church who were praying and who prayed with him, and their families say, you know what, we forgive him, I am not going to tell them they can't forgive the murderer of their families. What I will say is to the people who say, oh, why can't they forgive them? Why can't they do this? It's none of your concern. It has become a problem, I think, that Black people face, that we can't express righteous anger. We always have to be calm, cool, and collected because the Black angry man or woman stereotype. So we always have to forgive. We always have to say, oh, yeah, I prayed to God about it. I have to forgive. Nonsense, rubbish. And as a student of history, I remember there was, after the Holocaust, there was a group of 45, half of them were Holocaust survivors, half of them were not. and they formed a plan. And the plan, in our modern day sense, would be horrific. It would be terrible. Their plan was to kill 6 million Germans in response to the Holocaust. Now, that was plan B. Plan B failed. And so plan A. Plan B was to poison former members of the SS who were imprisoned in some part of Germany. And that failed too. But there are limits. There are limits to forgiveness. There are limits to how much the human experience can go on, especially when they're being persecuted, especially when they have to deal with violence, harassment, and brutality. I feel that there's a limit, and I feel, especially for Black people, it's no longer tolerable. We are at breaking point. And I've always had, like I said, I've always had this problem with the notion of forgiveness because it's always on or placed upon the victim to embrace that forgiveness rather than the consequences of the actions of those people who caused the harm is never focused on. And I think we as a people need to reflect on that. And I also think when I say we, the Black community, but also the wider Jewish community that we all belong to, they need to reflect on, you can, like Tova said, you can have intentions and you can say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not a racist, but you still said something racist. You need to put your money where your mouth is and take action and combat it rather than give me an apology, because an apology nowadays for me is worthless because we always say sorry. As a Canadian, it's our thing. We always say, I'm sorry. Sorry for that. Sorry for this. But at this day and age, for me, an apology is worthless unless you accept there has to be a consequence at the end of this apology, and you need to change and you need to better yourself. So for me, there's limits. There's limits.
I really like how this, I actually really appreciate your challenge. And the challenge is with the question of what is forgiveness and what are the limits. And I saw that there was some vigorous nodding of the heads on certain points that you were saying. So I actually want to just give a little bit of space, Tova and Claire, if there's anything that resonated in such a way that you want to, kind of like hop in and kind of add something to that briefly. Would love to get your voices in here as well on that.
I definitely agree with everything that Tyler said. I think growing up for me, I was always expected to forgive people who had done wrong to me, whether it was in school or any other situation. And I also believe that within the Black community, we have a problem with over forgiving. And I think a lot of it is like a religious thing. I think it has to do with a lot of with religion. And I honestly am trying to work to the place in which Tyler is speaking of. Like, I feel like, today somebody, I could try to forgive somebody. I've forgiven people. I've forgiven Jewish people in my life who have hurt me deeply. And I want to get to the place in which I'm not necessarily running around holding a grudge, because that's not good for my peace. Like, I do not want to be holding grudges anymore, but I don't want to allow people to cross a line and think that they can get away with it, because I'm tired. I don't owe anybody my peace or my calmness. My people have been through enough. There's been enough intergenerational trauma that my people have gone through in this land. Other people should be begging for forgiveness. That's what it really should be. I should not be there should be lines of people. Every Black person in this country should have lines of people all around them, begging them to forgive them for the ways in which this country has harmed Black people. So everything that Tyler said is definitely what I'm working towards.
So that's part of and since the word teshuva, as we know, kind of like is about return. It's kind of like that's what you're, in a way, you're trying to return to that, trying to orient yourself towards that. That's lovely. Claire, how about for you? Like, there were a couple of moments I saw you were nodding, and I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add to that. Though obviously, no pressure if you feel like it was said.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with much of what Tyler and Tova just said. For me, forgiveness and consequences are not necessarily separate. I also feel similarly to Tova in that I refuse to carry a grudge for my own well-being. And I think I live with a certain level of unattachment to situations, again, for my own well-being. But I 100% agree with Tyler that consequences are necessary. There's a certain amount of learning that requires consequences. And I think learning and using that learning to act differently is key to upcoming forgiveness or potential forgiveness.
So one question that I'm always asking myself, because there are several terms that have become very, very popular in the last couple of years, one of them being structural racism. And then it's almost become a script in some places. And yet when you see the ways that people are using it, you're like, I'm not sure if you actually understand what that means. And it's always made me ask the question of like, okay, people have a really relatively easy time maybe understanding like individual racism, but it can be, and maybe some people have a real clear idea of what structural racism is, but oftentimes what isn't talked about is kind of that gap that's between them, or maybe it's talked about in certain circles, but in a lot of the conversation around structural racism, individual racism, there's like so much missing from the conversation. And so when I think about like this work of teshuva, of return and forgiveness, I'm curious, like, what does that look like socially? So I've heard some of you say like individuals seeking like forgiveness from you, but I'd love to hear what you all think are the most powerful ways to accomplish teshuva, and especially if it somehow bridges the individual and the societal. And Tova, curious how that lands with you.
I think when we're speaking about the Jewish community, even though I said earlier that I'm not, the priority for teshuva for me is not, appointing Jews of color and Black Jews to, positions of authority, but it's more important that you actually do the work to learn about who we are and our identities. It is important that in order to bridge the individual and societal inequalities that Jews of color and Black Jews face, Black Jews in particular need to be uplifted organizationally in Jewish literature and in media and social media and things like that. I feel like I should not be looking at the leadership positions and boards at major Jewish organizations, and there aren't any Black Jews or a Jewish person who has an experience of being a person of color in this country. There needs to be, donations. There needs to be inclusions in programs that aren't necessarily requiring the Jew of color or the Black Jew to educate, to be for their role to be an educator. I think that that's really important because, and I'm just speaking within the context of the Jewish community, because I think that that's going to be very applicable to people who are listening to this, because you may know a Black Jewish person, you might have a friend, a Hebrew school teacher who is a Black Jew, but I think things can change when there are Black Jews and Jews of color who are actually making decisions and being productive representation in Jewish institutions, day schools, curriculum, etc. Because not only does it give good representation and productive representation for Jews of color, but it also helps the larger Jewish community see that it is normal to have a person who looks like any one of us as a leader in the Jewish community. I think that that is actually very important. It's not the only way, but that's just something that I think is important.
Absolutely. And I mean, to just, put one thing in there, it's like, and in accomplishing that, we might also want to think about like, hey, if we want Jews of color, Black Jews to have board seats and things like that, maybe it shouldn't cost $75,000 to be on that board. And that's not just a thing of justice, for Jews of color. That's also a thing of justice for Jews who experience poverty. There are Jews who experience poverty. And so if we really want to diversify those ideas that will help represent Klal Israel, you got to think about that as well. Anyways, had to put my 2 cents out there. Claire, how about for you? What do you think are some of the most powerful ways to accomplish Teshuva that might bridge that personal and the societal?
I agree with basically all of what Tova just said. I think it's a process of listening, learning, and adjusting, like I mentioned before. And there has to be an open-mindedness, I think, on all sides, between those seeking forgiveness and those forgiving, especially on a societal level, and in our communities. And I absolutely love the idea of bringing Black Jewish voices or Jew of color voices to the forefront. And I think something in Aaron's piece at the end, they were chanting, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And a young child's voice came to the forefront. And I think it's so important to, of course, think about the now, but also look towards the future of what we can be doing for the upcoming generations of Jews of color and how that dynamic is going to be shifting, just thinking about numbers in general and how we don't need to, but I hope to pave the way for those to come, so that it can be easier for them. Even though it wasn't easy for me, I do want it to be easier for those coming after me.
Absolutely. Someone who works in any number or has worked in any number of day school settings, or I guess more like Jewish after school settings, where I just, see these wonderful faces of all of these young Jews of color, may it be so that they will step into situations that are far more welcoming and far more supportive. Tyler, our friend who is making the case for, hey, the limits of forgiveness, I think also making it really powerfully. One of the first things you mentioned, especially with respect to Toronto, is like, there have been some, like, the ways in which you have interacted with institutions is really, like, that is a challenge. So I'm especially curious to hear, what do you think might be some of the most powerful ways to accomplish that kind of teshuva that bridges that gap between, the individual realness that you're bringing and that, that systemic reality?
Oh Lord, let me get into it now.
Get into it for us. We're here for it.
So, for me, for using one organization, I'll get into others, but for one, Hillel, Ontario. So for me, I wasn't in the beginning because I started school in 2012. Hillel, Ontario, for me, was not welcoming. It was never welcoming for me. And I've said this countless times. And the reason for that was at one point, it was just vibe. And then when I started going often, I realized no one who worked there looked like me. Absolutely no one. And it became very apparent. like I remember one guy, another university student was there. He asked me what I was doing there in the Hillel building at the University of Toronto, and he asked me what I was doing there, and I looked at him. Well, I I I have a reason here. I don't need to tell you. And he said it. Well, if you're not Jewish, why are you here? And yeah, that type of thing. And at the time, there wasn't anyone who looked like me or who I thought I could go and tell or report this and say, this needs to be dealt with. And I've always had this issue, and it came to a head when a couple of months ago, Hello Ontario released this post about Juneteenth. And I'm a very blunt person. And I commented and I said, this post has nothing to do with Black Canadians. This is an African American holiday. This was started in Texas. There's no connection to us with this holiday unless there is a bunch of African Americans living in Toronto in a little colony here, and they celebrate this every year. We have no connection to it as Black Canadians. And they responded and I said, okay, please email us. And I sent a long email and I said why this is wrong and why there is a holiday that most Black Canadians celebrate, kind of the same as Juneteenth. Um, it was August 1st, Emancipation Day. Many Caribbean Black Canadians celebrate it when slavery was abolished in the British Empire. That is our day in Canada now. It was actually recognized like a year before you guys finally recognized Juneteenth as a federal holiday. So I said this in the email. It wasn't harsh. Well, my original comment said the reason why you guys posted this Juneteenth post was because you have no diversity within your employment area in Hillel. Maybe too blunt, but I was angry. I was angry. And the response I got was not great. Very paternalistic, very well, in one case of the email, he said, well, you should have contacted me before you aired this criticism and attacked our staff. And that is the issue that I have when it comes to structural racism within a Jewish organization. It's this, we don't want to hear or listen to you, but if you attack us or you criticize us, come to us first. Don't air in public. And that's a problem I have because self-improvement means being open about the criticisms and the problems and solving them publicly. And sure, they made that emancipation post, but they didn't consult Black Jews here in Toronto. I know that. I know I wasn't consulted. I know no other Black Jew was consulted about the dynamics of making this Emancipation Day post and honoring it from the Hillel standpoint. But it's things like that. It's up here, it's like we're ignored. And it's only when we are needed for whether it be a presentation or a video or panel, then you get the email and say, oh, Tyler, we need this here for you and all that. And it became apparent, because now I'm moving into another organization, the Federation up here, we did a panel discussion of ever Black Jewish Canadians about an evening of quiet listening. We talked about racism and discrimination within the Jewish community in the wider context. And it went well, but nothing happened afterwards. And I remember getting another email about them wanting me to do a panel about Congressman Lewis and his death. And in my head, I'm like, why are we doing a panel about a US congressman? Yes, a civil rights icon, but why are we doing a panel about him in a Canadian context when we have our own issues when it comes to civil rights, including Black people, including Indigenous people. There's been no panel about Indigenous Canadians within the Jewish context here, but we want to do a panel about Congressman Lewis, and that's where the priorities are. And I remember I pitched an idea to the virtual JCC up here because of COVID and all, and I said I want to do a panel discussion between JOC and non-JOC Jews, where we go at it. We discuss racism within the Jewish community. We discuss how to do things. We discuss what areas we can both work together. And I pitched it. I wrote an email. I did the application. That was like 4 months ago. No response, no nothing. I never got an email back. And I feel for me, when we're tackling structural racism within the Jewish context, any Jew of color in a position of authority within these Jewish structures is the most important thing for us, because we get a voice, especially when you're in a community where it's not as diverse, especially in the United States. As the Canadian Jewish population, we are not as diverse. We don't have a lot of Jews of color that are visibly in leadership. And for me, that is doing real forgiveness, being inclusive, including Jews of color in leadership decisions, leadership positions, including their voice when it comes to board meetings, including them when you're writing policy, especially that affects Jewish youth, who, granted, by the time I'm probably 40 years old, the Canadian Jewish population will be as diverse as ever. So I have hope. But we don't have that here in Canada. We don't have that. And for me, this is why in the beginning I said it's so hard for me to even accept forgiveness from Canadian Jewish organizations, because they do not want to put into the work. They don't want to do it. They don't find it important. It's like they have no need for it. Their focus is anti-Semitism, which is important, but a wise man once told me, you can chew and walk with gum at the same time. You can do it both. There's no, I can't do one, no, you can do both. So for me, there's a lot of work to be done. Forgiveness, you have to put the money where your mouth is, for me.
Absolutely. I mean, Teshuva, like, there's action that comes with that. Tyler, thank you so much for your specificity, and also for bringing up the fact, I mean, it's one of the things that I know, like, I've actually had the joy of collaborating with some Canadian artists and Canadian Jew of color artists. And one of the things that I feel is too often overlooked is, like, when we talk about, North America, we talk about US and Canada, usually the focus becomes so heavily on the US that it crowds out Canadian voices. So your specificity is very much appreciated. And I really think that it adds so much richness and reminds us that we have regional realities. And one thing, this is kind of like as a word to those who might be watching, something I didn't do earlier is, like, as we've gone through this conversation, I can imagine that some folks watching, that their shoulders have started to creep up, that their hearts have started to beat faster. They might feel sweaty or something like that. I want to tell you, notice what's happening in your body. Because I think especially what's being related here, and the fact that there's so much agreement, and even in the points where there is difference, it's really difference of nuance, but not necessarily a difference of, like, I meant such a different place than you, which would be a vast disagreement, that there's some truth here. And so if there is that feeling of kinship and truth being spoken here, and it happens to be bringing that visceral discomfort, I think that's something to unpack. personally, and especially I think this is being aired the day before Yom Kippur. There's no better time to address that and think about that than right now. So if you're feeling that, great, and lean into it. Now, for this final question, kind of like our rapid response question here, is about one of the hallmarks of the high holidays, the shofar. So throughout Jewish tradition, the shofar represents a number of different things. It can be a call to battle. It can announce a specific time of year. It's a reminder that the gates of forgiveness are closing or are closed. Regardless of whatever its purpose, the shofar is a sign that you need to pay attention. So my final question for you all is this. If you had one idea to blast like a shofar to the heavens and to get the attention of everyone watching, what would that one idea be? And Claire, let's start with you.
I'll echo some of my previous thoughts. Active listening, open-mindedness, and compassionate responses are all invaluable tools when it comes to relationships, whether on an individual level or a societal level. And I would encourage everyone listening to try them, or try them again if you already have.
Wonderful, wonderful shofar blast there. Tyler, how about for you?
For me, it would be to open one's mind and one's heart to the suffering of others without having to go through that suffering to feel anything. Because for many people, this is difficult because unless they are not personally affected by something, they will never understand the situation. They can never sympathize or have emotion. And I've always been troubled by that because I'm no saint. I have trouble with that myself too. And I've worked on that. But I feel that if I had a shofar, that would be my message to the heavens because it's one of the most valuable tools to understanding discrimination, to understanding racism, to understanding what Black people, what Indigenous people, well, in the Canadian context, deal with. Because we up here, we are still dealing with the fact that our country was built on the literal lives of Indigenous people, and we took their children, put them in residential schools where thousands of them died, and we're now discovering the mass graves up here. And the news has conveniently shifted that focus, but they're still finding mass graves still up here. And I feel that if the same is done across the border, there will be the same thing found. And I feel that people need to understand that the complexities, especially in the Jewish community, we need to be open. We need to be able to have open hearts and open minds to understanding these issues and to empathize with people who do not share our own suffering.
Amen. Tova, how about for you?
So if I were to blast like a shofar, I think, we say to the heavens. I'm thinking about actually more so speaking to Hashem, like in prayer, in a way of sounding like a shofar. And it's actually a shift into more of a joyful sound in thanking Hashem, thanking God for making me who I am. That I was made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim. That Hashem knows who I am, who I am, and I am a Black Jew, and I was made that way, and that is beautiful. And Hashem knows who I am and the hard work that I'm doing. And I think one of the only, figures, if we can even place Hashem in that in that language, who understands me is Hashem, who truly understands me, because I think humanity is flawed. And Hashem knows our hearts and knows who we are. And if everyone else was to listen, everyone else would hear how thankful I am for the traditions that I have, how thankful I am for my Blackness, for my Judaism, for my family, for my people. And that's kind of what I would like just to end with my own statement, because even I can speak personally as, you know, the ways in which I've offered critique and I've explained how difficult it is being a Black Jew, and kind of the trials and tribulations that some of us go through. I am grateful to be who I am. And that is the most important thing. I just want to see Black Jews at peace and being able to pray and live their life, and just live their life and no longer have to be surviving. And so, you know, people can have criticisms of what I say or what anybody else in this panel could say, but at least I know at the end of the day, I do not really care, because I know I was created by Hashem and I am a Black Jewish woman, and no one can take that away from me. No one is more or less Jewish than I am. And so I will always hold that gratitude in my heart. And I always just try to make sure that I can serve Hashem in the best way I can. And that's through trying to be kind and to reach out to people and to have conversations like these.
Amen, amen to everything that you shared, Tova, and that all of you shared. To share some of the words, actually, I think it was Aaron, our poet, who wrote this, that as Jews, we have this obligation to reflect every year on the harm we've caused others, and the spiritual expectation to repair any of that harm and live in such a way that we can move forward and not repeat that harm. And so we reflect on this every year. And forgiveness, both the piece, the poem, and so much of what you all shared, I think really challenges the listeners and the people viewing this to confront the reality that we have more work to do to cure this pandemic of racism in our world. And just to quote one of my favorite rabbis in the world, the wonderful James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And thank you all so much for your wonderful insights and thoughts in helping us face that today as we head towards the end of our high holiday season. So a huge thank you to Tova Ricardo, to Tyler Samuels, to Claire Nyman. I am Kendell Pinkney, and wishing all of our panelists and everyone out there, Gemar Chatima Tova, may you finish well, may you finish strong, may you be recorded in the book of life. May we all be recorded in the book of life. And it's wonderful to be in community with you. Thank you all.